Hi everyone, hope you're doing well today. I just wanted to talk about my first big read of the year, which is this history book, A History of East Asia by Charles Holcombe. And this isn't going to be a formal review by any means. I just wanted to go over some thoughts, talk about things I learned, and just basically go over a few things that stood out to me when reading this. Some of you know that I am half Vietnamese, and one of my goals for this year was to read more Vietnamese history and literature and just Asian history in general. It's part of my heritage that I'd like to learn more about, and this seemed like a good time to do it. So this book covers China, of course. It also covers Japan and Korea and also Vietnam. The second edition specifically has sections on Vietnam, as well as Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. So it's a really good overview, I would say. It's good as in the content is good. The writing style I found to be very academic and a little bit, I don't know if boring's the word, just kind of not what I was hoping for. But as an overview, it's pretty good. Before I get started, just want to mention I have read a couple of books on China already, and I'll show you to those really quickly. First one is CEO China by Carrie Brown. Really thought this was an excellent book. It's a biography of sorts, but honestly, there's not a lot of information about the Chinese president, so it basically goes over what is known about him and then talks a lot about his leadership style, his policies, and the direction that he is taking China. It was a riveting book. I'll link to the book review I did of this on my blog if you're interested. And then I also read AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order by Kai-Fu Lee. And this is a very sensationally titled book, but it was honestly extremely interesting. I would call it a history of technology in China, how they do things compared to how we do things, we as in people in the United States, and really a cultural comparison. And then he also talks about automation and where that is leading both of our economies. Really great book. Highly recommend this if you can find it. And so yeah, that's basically the extent of my knowledge. Very much recent stuff, technology oriented. So this is going back to the beginning, literally the origins of civilization to the 21st century. Now, this is a very academic book. As you can see, the text is very dense. There are some pictures, but very, very academic, which means it's got, good sources and things, which is great. But personally, I did find the writing style to be pretty dry. And so if you're looking for something riveting, this is not that book. Yeah. But I was really determined to get this overview, so I really wanted to plow through this, and it really was an effort to read. So yeah, it starts out with what is the concept of East Asia. And as I was reading the book, I kind of understood why in the first edition he left out Vietnam as part of East Asia. But in the second edition, he added on content to cover that. So that was good for me personally. But he talks about how the concept of East Asia is kind of this loose geographical / cultural designation, or not really designation, but a label, and rooted very much in the character system, the Chinese character system. And he goes in depth about that, and he writes very, very carefully. So he qualifies a lot of what he says, but it essentially that, and the Confucian values as well, and Buddhism as well. So those are some of the things that constitute this idea of East Asia, at least from his perspective. Origins, so yeah, talking about the first peoples, the formative era. So this is when the dynasties first came to be. So you've got the Zhou dynasty, mentions the art of war. And then he just, each chapter follows the dynasties, these different eras, and are mostly broken down into a Chinese section, a Korean section, and a Japanese section. And to be perfectly honest, I found like the first half of this book to be very difficult to read and follow. It wasn't that he didn't write clearly, but there's so much repetition in what's going on here. So, you've got one family rises up in power, and then some of those family members kill other family members, and then they take over, and then suddenly you have people from a non-ethnic Chinese coming in and taking over. And so very, very repetitive, lots of little kingdoms in addition to the sense of a unified dynasty. And yeah, very repetitive. But most history is, to be honest. Some things that really stood out to me, which I wasn't necessarily aware of, for one thing, there's been this tension between Korea and Japan going way back, which I wasn't necessarily aware of. Some other things. I mean, it's kind of commonly known that China was once very much a global country before they became isolationist, so that was kind of talked about, of course. So yeah, Vietnam being added in the second edition really doesn't show up till chapter 7, and it's a pretty short chapter, as you can see. I was hoping for more detail, so I was a little disappointed that it wasn't worked into these other chapters chronologically. It just was sort of added on, so it is what it is. Okay, and then we've got 19th century colonization, when it really was at its peak, and then westernization, World War II, and then everything after World War II. That's kind of how it's broken down. One thing that is good about this being an academic book is that you've got pronunciation guide, which to be honest I kind of skipped. But you do have this nice timeline here, so if you are someone who likes timelines, which I do, this might be a nice thing to copy as a reference for future reading. He's got a glossary, and then in the back he's even has and again, this isn't something I'll be using personally, but he's got terms and their Chinese characters. So yeah. So now I'd like to go through the things I highlighted, and these are going to be completely random, so bear that in mind. So first thing that I guess really jumped out to me was I try to mark like milestones. So when China was, unified pretty much for good was like the 600s under the Sui dynasty. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But one really cool thing they did was they created this Grand Canal, a man-made waterway linking the Yangtze River in the south to the Yellow River in the north. I remember learning about that on a documentary. I think the documentary was hosted by Michael Wood. I think that was his name. So look him up if you want to watch an interesting documentary about China. I was actually pretty pleased how much I remembered from that documentary. So definitely check that out. There's some good pictures here, so that's cool. I'm just sort of, I really didn't mark a lot in this early sections. These sections I was just trying to get through because they're kind of very detailed, and yet not super interesting. This is not an author who includes a ton of anecdotes. So if you're looking for that kind of book, this really isn't it. I mean, there are some, and sometimes he'll throw out something really intriguing, but doesn't elaborate on it. So, yeah. Here's one of the samurais in the 1800s. One thing I will say is that this book does have some great maps. They're not too fancy, they're just what you want to know. So here's a good map showing, you know, the Mongols and stuff, so that's pretty cool. The Mongol World Empire. Yeah. Pretty interesting stuff. Okay, so next really interesting thing that stood out to me was, you know, the Opium Wars. How did that get started? Well, let's see. Western merchants sold many different products in exchange for Chinese tea, silk, porcelain, and lacquerware. Only rarely could they sell enough to balance the exchange. The deficit had to be made up with payment in cash, and in China, their currency at that time, and this was like, okay, early 1800s, was silver. One contemporary American, for example, estimated that between 1805 and 1825, a net 62 million US dollars in cash was transferred from the US to China. Western merchants were naturally, therefore, interested in finding a product that they could market successfully in China, and in the late 1700s they did, and that was opium. And opium was not illegal in a lot of places back then, but it was illegal in China. So you can kind of understand why they turned to that, but at the same time, it was still wrong of them to sell it in China since it was illegal. But yeah, that's how I got started, and I didn't really realize that. I almost feel like it would have been, I mean, as much as I was hoping this book would be an overview, and it is, it did leave me feeling it might have been nice to read separate books about these different countries, because in each era you read China, Korea, Japan, China, Korea, Japan, and it is easy to forget sometimes, you know, the sequence in a specific country. So another thing that was interesting to me was the Japanese-Germany alliance. I didn't realize that started back in the 1800s. At least one or two of these Japanese, in this case an oligarch, went to Germany and learned about the German model. That is their the way that their government was set up and such. So it started way before World War II. So I thought that was very interesting. I also learned that some of the brands that we recognize are actually really old. I think Nissan was mentioned as one of the older brands that's still around, so that was interesting. Mitsubishi is another one. So yeah. Let's see, where are we now? We're going into the 1900s already, which is where it got more readable for sure. Okay, so another thing I did not know was that Pearl Harbor, and this could just be my sheer terrible ignorance, but I wasn't aware that Pearl Harbor was part of a series of Japanese invasions, or maybe I knew at one point but had forgotten. But not only did they attack Pearl Harbor, but they attacked British Malaya, Hong Kong, Manila, and they also attacked Singapore and other parts of the Philippines, and they almost invaded India as well, which I did not realize. Very interesting. Here's a nice map showing different movements of the forces involved. So It's pretty cool. All right, so moving on. Here's an interesting fact. The Japanese Constitution, which is still being used today, was written basically in the span of a week by Americans. And this was back in 1946, 1947. I did not know that. That is crazy. But fascinating at the same time. So I didn't learn as much about Vietnam as I might have liked to learn. But I did learn a few things I wasn't aware of before. In Vietnam, they have this saying that they were ruled by the French for 100 years, but 1,000 years by the Chinese. One thing I didn't know pertaining to this colonization is that there was this temporary liberation in the... Let's see, I think this was just right after World War II. Yes, so here we go. Despite Japanese occupation, routine French colonial administration of Vietnam continued throughout most of World War II until March 1945, when the Japanese finally seized power directly and disarmed and interned the French. The following day, the Japanese named the last Nguyen dynasty ruler, Bao Dai, emperor of a nominally independent Vietnam within the Japanese-controlled Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Not only that, but... Well, anyway, basically there was this period of nominal independence, which was kind of interesting. But then they went back to the French after that, and then they weren't liberated until... Let's see. Oh, boy. So they returned northern Vietnam to the French in 1946. And then... I'm trying to see the year of French withdrawal. Okay, 1954. There we go. And then the war began shortly after that, which we were really involved quite early on, which you may not realize, but we were sending... Well, actually, so independence 1954, but by that time, the United States was also funding French military presence there, largely. So we were involved really early on, if not in the war, then certainly our presence, our military assistance, I should say, was there in terms of supplies and so on. So, okay, just a couple more here. Again, some of the stuff might be really obvious to people, but I have to say I did learn quite a few things that I didn't know. So the sections at the end about these different countries since 1945, I thought they were fairly interesting. Especially relevant, of course, is the section on Hong Kong. One thing I didn't know is, let's see, this is how it's worded. Hong Kong, this was back in 1984, Hong Kong would become a special administrative region of the People's Republic, allowed to keep its own capitalist society for at least 50 years under the formula one country, two systems. So it's not been quite 40 years since that happened. I'm kind of curious if the tensions that are happening right now are going to build up, and if there's going to be some early culmination of that before 50 years, or what would even happen if 50 years elapsed. Like what happens after that? I don't know. That's something I would want to read more about. So yeah, I would say one thing this book doesn't mention, and I even checked the index, is I didn't see any mention of the Belt and Road Initiative, or at least there might have been one passing reference to it, but it wasn't in the index, so I'm thinking it's not in here. Okay, sorry about that. My camera bailed at the last minute. I think it's getting tired. So the Belt and Road is basically a modern Silk Road, except it's not physical roads. It's a network of, well, basically an economic network. So in practice, what happens is China goes to different countries, such as countries in Africa, and offers assistance in various ways, such as building hospitals, roads, infrastructure, that kind of thing. And in return, those countries hand over resources to China. So, yeah, it's actually quite a large network now. And it's not something that I know a lot about specifically, but it's worth reading into. I know that it was talked about quite a bit in this book, Carrie Brown's CEO China, towards the end anyway. And not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but other ways China is becoming more global. So it's certainly something to learn about, especially as China seeks to compete with the United States economically. And we'll see where it goes. I would just add that it's hard for me to feel optimistic about these developments based on China's human rights abuses, especially, I mean, there's horrific things going on there right now as we speak. And, you know, this is something to be aware of as we view China's increasing globalization, and something to learn about. And I do think books like this are good for helping us have context on, you know, what led up to where we are now. And yeah, so it's a lot. It's a lot. It's heavy, but it's really important to learn about. And I have certainly taken away from this book ideas of other things I'd like to read more about. So yeah, that's all I have for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video if you did, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.